Hello and welcome to the Sussex Azure User Group podcast. We're on episode 22 now, and time's flying by. So happy Easter, everyone. I should probably get that one in early, but yeah, as usual, I'm joined by my colleague and friend Jack. How you doing?
Hey Ryan, yeah, I'm good. Good to be back. It's been a few weeks.
That's been a few weeks, but yeah, it feels like we're easing out of lockdown now. Hopefully we're just saying that hopefully we had to do the next one or maybe the one after from the pub. Fingers crossed.
Maybe. Fingers crossed.
So this week,
indeed.
this week we're joined by a colleague of ours, Chris Bennett from our customer success unit, and Chris specializes in something called Well Architected Framework. Now we've done previous podcasts on things like enterprise scale and cloud adoption framework, and we really wanted to bring Chris in to talk to us about what Well Architected Framework is, at what point you use it, how it helps your business. So Chris, I've kind of done your intro for you, so apologies, but I'll let you introduce yourself properly.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Jack. And thanks ever so much for the invite as well. Really cool to be on the show with you. I'm Chris Bennett. Like Jack, my fellow colleague, I'm a cloud solutions architect within our customer success unit. My predominant focus is helping customers migrate their workloads to Azure, which is kind of a natural fit, I guess, for the well-architected framework as well, which takes a bit of a sort of workload, sort of focused lens on ensuring that your workloads that you're either migrating to Azure or running on Azure are as reliable as they can be, as secure as they can be, and so forth.
Awesome. So yeah, no, it's a really hot topic, and I think as you sort of alluded to, Ryan, we've got so many things out there now with CAFWAF. Yes, we're called out now. WAF. We know that it's a reused abbreviation and an acronym. Yes, it's not
talking about firewalls.
We're not talking about firewalls, although I'll happily dive down that networking rabbit hole. But we've got lots of these things in this space now. So I think probably the first thing for us to really clear up, Chris, and be really good to get your perspective on this is how do they all fit together? How do they work and play together? So we've got CAF, WAF, and enterprise scale. What do you use when? Are they the same thing? Is there any overlap? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I guess my take is it's kind of all of the above, almost in a way, Jack. So I guess for those people that have watched your podcast before, I know you've spoken a lot about CAF and enterprise scale, and I guess where you can basically draw a bit of a line is to say that CAF and enterprise scale kind of really focuses on the people and process side of things, and obviously enterprise scale is where the technology adoption of CAF comes into play, and then of course that's all about setting that solid foundation in play for your workloads. Whereas WAF, as I kind of already mentioned, is very much workload focused. So it's less on the underlying platform and more focused on driving workload quality for workloads that sit on top of the platform.
So Chris, Jack and I work with lots of customers in terms of moving workloads into Azure, modernizing, transformation, and obviously it's because of that shared responsibility and shifting that responsibility over to Microsoft to keep the infrastructure alive. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways of designing workloads to be resilient, cost-effective, secure in different ways. And when I was reading about WAF earlier, it mentioned these pillars that kind of make up WAF. Could you just kind of talk us through what those pillars are and what they mean?
Yeah, sure. So kind of as you alluded to there are 5 pillars as part of the well-architected framework. So they're cost optimization, reliability, operational excellence, performance efficiency, and security. And really, the way to kind of think about these is in a sort of trade-off. So decisions that you make within a particular pillar will usually have some form of impact on another pillar. And you need to make those decisions depending on what's right for your business, yeah? So if, for example, I've migrated a workload into the cloud, let's say, the crown jewels for any sort of business, SAP, for example, and that to be very, very highly available. But as a result of making that decision of wanting that workload to be highly available, that's going to have a cost implication, right? So it's going to be more expensive to run that workload on public cloud as a result of making that decision. So if I've defined that I want that workload to be available 99.995% of the time, then be prepared for the fact that obviously that is going to come at a cost. But at the same time, then I can use best practice guidance within the cost pillar to kind of soften that hit a little bit, if you will. So there's certain thing that I can take advantage of. Taking the SAP workload as an example, it is a predominantly IaaS-based workload, so I can look at additional options like leveraging reserved instances to reduce the cost. If I'm running development environments, I can look at leveraging things like Azure, VM shutdown, so I'm limiting the costs, or I can run those workloads within a developer subscription to lower the costs. So it's really all just about getting the right balance for the business across all of those 5 pillars.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of wording it, Chris. Like the whole way you said that they're trade-offs. I've never really thought about it in that way, but you're absolutely bang on, right? Because you're right. If you go and want a massive availability and you want, that reliability to be high, you're definitely going to be impacted in cost because you're going cross-regional, cross-AZs, and there's multiple instances coming up. So I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, and definitely something I'm going to steal and use for my customers. So thanks for the tip. So we'll take that from there. I suppose before we dive much further into WAF, I suppose it's a fairly new thing, right? This is maybe 9 months, a year old. Like, how long has it been around?
Yeah, I think we started to see the first WAF documentation hit Azure Docs in around about 2019. There was a big focus on cost optimization at that time. I mean, who doesn't want to save money, right? Whatever business you're in. So that's kind of where a lot of the effort took place first to develop the content for cost optimization. But very, very quickly, we've seen that content develop across the other pillars as well. So it's kind of at a stage, I would say now, I kind of look at it almost as being at the same stage as CAF. We've seen that maturity of CAF really sort of rise quite rapidly. And now obviously we're still seeing changes to the documentation. We're seeing, some really great additions. But kind of that maturity curve has started to level off a bit now. So I think the documentation is, really quite fully formed and in a good place to help customers with respect to landing their workloads on Azure and ensuring that quality is high.
Yeah.
So going back to those 5 pillars, obviously they kind of span, thinking of from an organizational view, they span multiple subjects, right? So security would be aimed at the security team, cost optimization, there may be involvement from procurement and things like that. I'm assuming that this isn't just aimed at cloud architects looking to design a solution. It's kind of multifaceted in terms of who you need to bring into these conversations when you're trying to adopt WAF.
Absolutely. I mean, cloud is a team sport, right? It's not just about the technology people. So, bringing in all of those other parts of the organization, as you alluded to there, like, finance people, for example, are really, really key to the cost optimization discussion. Reliability. You can't have the technology people making decisions in isolation about how reliable a workload should be. You need to have that interaction with the business to make these decisions. So, well architected is definitely not just about the tech people. It's it should be leveraged as best practice from across the business, and bringing people in from across the business is really important, just as it is in CAF.
The reliability piece is certainly close to my heart at the moment, because I've seen so many different implementations over the years of, take SQL Server for one, right? So if you have licenses bought in a certain way and they're not very portable and things like that for SQL Server, a typical deployment way is to deploy single SQL servers on a dedicated host, so they don't have to, they can transition licensing in. It's the cheapest way of running it. But from a reliability standpoint, single instance, dedicated host, there's performance bottlenecks. It's not a great position to be in, right? So I guess you're taking that cost optimization piece by using something like dedicated host, but at the same time, the reliability thing goes out the window because you've got all your eggs in one basket. You've not got SQL clustering or anything else. So do you ever find it where one is kind of playing off against the other, and it's hard to achieve that balance?
Not necessarily hard to achieve that balance, but I guess what I would say is there's some tough decisions usually to be made. And you think about the way we architected workloads in the past. It's very different to the way we architect workloads in the cloud. And naturally, most customers will tend to pick up what they have as a starting point because it's kind of the path of least resistance to get your workload over to cloud and then evolve from there. So when you think about the way we approach things in the past, we generally had super expensive, high-end hardware virtualization stacks. So we didn't necessarily need to think about architecture the way we do in cloud. So most people would have lots of singleton virtual machines running on-prem, for example, and be quite comfortable in the fact that they've got their massively expensive SAN, their VMware cluster, so that workload can just naturally move around if they have a hardware failure. And that's the way they've always operated. And suddenly you pick up that singleton VM and move it to cloud. It's a different story from a reliability perspective. So you need to start to think about that a little differently. You need to start thinking about, do I leverage availability zones? How do I think about, a multi-region approach? So it really does kind of turn the whole way you think about architecting these solutions on its head. So, it doesn't matter when you start to leverage WAF. It could be prior to moving a workload to the cloud. It could be as part of the creation of a new workload on cloud, or migration, or after migration. It kind of fits all scenarios. But I guess the important thing is to start to consume and digest the material that's there around well architected, and that kind of switches your brain into gear into thinking about how you architect workloads appropriately for cloud and align to best practice.
I think you touched on a really nice point there, Chris. It's like it doesn't really matter when you approach WAF, whether it's in hindsight or whether it's proactively before deploying a workload. Actually, just using it is the right thing to do. Whether you've deployed or you haven't, using it at any stage is going to help you and make it for a better system, or at least know what you need to do to improve the system going forward. And that's something I definitely want to touch on going forward. But you also, at the end there, touched on a really nice point around educating people and getting people aware of, well architected and getting started. One thing that I was really pleased to see when I first started hearing about WAF internally and seeing it, going out publicly, was that the Microsoft Learn module was like straight out the door. It was there from day one. So you could throw customers at it and go, look, this is a really good investment of an hour, maybe an hour and a half of your time, just to go and learn the key concepts of the 5 pillars, what they all mean, what they stand for, what we're talking about, and where to go find more resources. And, especially covering some of the key topics like what SLAs are, what composite SLAs are, what RTOs, RPOs, MTTR. There's a lot of acronyms that we throw around quite easily in the cloud space, in technology in general, right? And we're all guilty of, do we actually know what they really mean? Are we all on the same page? So I don't know about you guys, but I certainly throw my customers to the learning link, and I'm going to show below here. But for those of you listening on the podcast, that's aka.ms/learn-WAF. And that will take you to an awesome MS Learn module on well architected. And I think there's a separate module in the path for each pillar from memory. Yes. But well worth. I know that all of us in Microsoft have had, as CSAs, we've had to do that as part of our learning requirements this year. So, I would strongly suggest that anybody in that space in cloud designing workloads or operating any workloads, it's well worth, an hour, 2 hours of your time. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more, Jack. It's a fantastic compilation of learning resources there. Now, obviously, it does cover all 5 pillars, so there's quite a lot of content to digest there. What I would say for most customers, if they're kind of starting looking at WAF now, kind of think about what's most important to you. So don't necessarily try and think about all 5 pillars, because cut the elephant down to digest it, so to speak. It's much easier. So I would always suggest to customers to start off looking at the one particular pillar that is probably of particular concern to them. And probably I would say 99.9% of customers I've interviewed with, they generally start with cost optimization or reliability. They're either concerned that they've migrated a workload to cloud and it's costing them too much or more than they expected, or kind of, as we touched on earlier on with the example, they started by migrating a singleton VM to the cloud. They might have been impacted with an outage, and then suddenly they're concerned about how reliable that workload is. So that's kind of where we tend to see customers start to land. And to help them break it down a little bit easily, we've also developed an assessment. So I guess for anyone who's watched your podcast before, they might have possibly touched on a number of the Microsoft assessments. So there is a a CAF assessment. There's a strategic migration assessment. So we've actually landed a well-architected assessment on the Microsoft assessment site. So this is where you can basically dive in and get a sort of curated experience. So say, for example, if you want to do a review of an existing workload, but you just want to start off small and maybe look at, say, reliability as an example. So you can tick an option there to look at reliability, and then it'll give you a sort of curated question and answer type experience to try and get some information from you about how you've architected that workload to date. What considerations have you made when you were architecting it? And then as a result of your answers to that, we'll give you some actionable guidance that it then is contained within the Azure Docs, so that you can start that journey and go off and look at how you can start that journey of improving your workload quality.
I don't know if it's on the roadmap, but it would be great to see that kind of functionality in Azure Advisor. We say, look at reserved instances to reduce costs and stuff, but if it could look at existing deployments and say, hey, if well-architected framework is suggesting that maybe you want to make this more resilient or more secure in this way, that would be awesome to see.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing progress in that space. I think most customers probably will have seen that you'll get the kind of what I would refer to as the standard recommendations. So, go and buy an RI. You've got a new public IP, delete it. You've got a singleton VM, maybe consider spreading it across availability zones or using an availability set. But it's never going to get to the stage that it can be, I guess, all things for all people, because it lacks that customer context. And obviously every customer's application is different, right? But definitely there's been great strides in what Azure Advisor can provide. And actually, when you run through the well-architected assessment that I just mentioned, if you sign into the portal through that experience, it gives you the option to then sign into the Azure portal as well, and we can pull those Azure Advisor recommendations into the assessment. Oh, right. So, cool. It's really, really useful. So we start to blend together not only the best practice advice that you get from the documentation, but also what we see in Azure Advisor as well. So don't get me wrong, I think there's more we can do for customers in that space on Azure Advisor, but it's certainly we're certainly making big strides.
Awesome. I guess it feels like the approach for people will be in two different ways, right? For new designs that are going into Azure, the well-architected framework can guide you in terms of ticking those boxes to make sure it's secure, resilient, performant, it's being deployed in the right way. But I'm just thinking from a listener's perspective, they're going to be thinking, right, I've got this workload. Maybe I need to run the assessment on there, or maybe they've had some kind of outage that's impacted them to really think about, is this designed in the right way? And unfortunately, outages do happen in public cloud, not just Azure, but in all public clouds, really. Maybe from a storage outage that we saw last year. But is that something that you see with customers? They're coming to you and saying, Azure had an outage. We weren't protected against it because maybe we had all our eggs in one basket in the way of the design. How do we retrospectively add this kind of capability to it?
Yeah, absolutely right. To be honest, that's been a very common ask. And actually, as you start to dig into the process and help guide customers through the documentation, the decisions that were made then become fully understood. And case in point is usually the migration example. Usually a lot of customers will be quick they want to get on that journey fast. They want to get out of an existing, say, data center arrangement. So they'll shift a workload to the cloud, but don't necessarily think about whether that needs to be re-architected. It may be that, decisions around things like Jack mentioned, acronyms that we band around, RTO, RPO, those might not have been considered when it was originally deployed on-prem, right? But you need to be thinking about that now. So as we start to get into these conversations with customers and we start to explain things like RTO and RPO to them, and how you need to think about in the public cloud context and how that affects your decision-making for the architecture of your workload in cloud, it's really great, because that really starts to get everyone in the room then thinking about, have we made the right decision here? And taking your example of the UK South outage, I've worked with a number of customers that were impacted by that, and it's become quite apparent to them quite quickly and running through these conversations and using the best practice guidance that they can then start to see that it was that decision-making process at the outset that maybe they didn't have that guidance at the outset, so they just took what they had and moved it. Whereas actually, if they'd had the WAF guidance in the first place, they would have been able to make a more informed decision in conjunction with the business as well.
So, I think it's a really nice way of. Yeah, and just sorry to cut in on you, Chris, but yeah, I also see it a lot with my customers in that sort of proactive reviewing, almost that they're making it now part of their like technical design authority or their sign-off processes before they even deploy workloads. That if anybody has got something they want to deploy into Azure, their actual process, first of all, is go through a well-architected review using the self-assessment tool, because then it gives them a nice report that's got a score on it, and data and numbers always means more than just, somebody's word for it, that they can actually use and say, if you can't meet a certain score, or you can't meet a certain score in certain categories, then you can't deploy this workload, or, not that you can't, but you need to do work to refine and improve that before we're happy that, it can meet our SLAs and our RTOs and RPOs that we define for that workload. But I think you made a really important point. Having those data points and those metric points for what you're designing against is so critical. I've had a lot of customer examples where I've been working with in sort of recent weeks where actually they haven't been defined. And actually, that's the most important question to answer, because, as you say, they all have a knock-on and trade-off effect. So if you just say, well, we want the best availability, well, we can design that for you, no problems at all. But you're going to need to get your checkbook out, because it will cost ample amount of money to make that happen. So, it's about, you can go one extreme and they're like, oh, it's too expensive. And you go the other extreme and it trades off against reliability. So having a sensible and educated SLA calculated that you want to achieve for your service is absolutely the best starting point that I would say for any customer approaching this, for the reliability pillar, that is.
That's a super interesting point, Jack. Yeah, and I think we both had those conversations where the customer will come to us and say, we want to make this as resilient as possible, but actually the project has a budget, and sometimes it takes that kind of different view of different architectures, and this is where WAF's really going to help to kind of demonstrate the fact that if you only need a 3.9 SLA, this is how you need to architect it. Yeah, you could go multi-region, you could go all bells and whistles if you want to make it, but if the business is only requiring that, this is how much it's going to cost, and it will fit within your budget. If you want to burst above that, it's going to cost you X amount more. So it's quite a nice way of having those conversations internally within your business to be able to get to, those points really in terms of reliability and cost. It's that trade-off, as you mentioned.
And would you say, Chris, that you see a lot of customers, going down that similar approach now? Now they've sort of, they've got the taste of WAF, let's call it that. They now go, actually, this is going to become part of our pre-deployment approval process for new workloads, or, we're going to adopt this as part of our sign-off process for new workloads. Have you seen that happen in many of your customers?
Yeah, funny enough, actually, I guided a customer through a review of a workload that they were running on Azure. So it was essentially their customer-facing website, customer-facing portal. So they were running that on app service and SQL backend. And as a result of that reliability review session that we conducted with them, firstly, it showed them quite quickly that actually they had an SLA that they couldn't meet based on the services and the architecture that they deployed. So great that we kind of serviced that issue. But also at the same time, at the end of the session, they really started to see the value that WAF could bring, and subsequently then took the knowledge that they gained from having us as a CSA on site with them, helping them through that process, that once they got to grips with the documentation and the kind of key decision points that they had to make, they were able to then leverage that knowledge and say, right, we're actually going to go off and review 10 other workloads that we're already running on Azure to make sure we're in a good place. And then as a consequence of that, as you kind of alluded to, based on all of that learning, they were able to say, you know what, we're going to bake this in as part of our processes to ensure that nothing's going to go into production until, as you say, it kind of meets a minimum bar, especially in areas like security, right? You want to be making sure that you've got some fundamental guardrails in place before you move into production.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see, and I think the fact that all this guidance is free and the assessment itself is free that you can run yourself is great to see. We're not hiding anything, and we're giving you all of the tools that you need to be able to go and look at to make those decisions on your workloads. And I think one of the nice things is in the reliability one. It seems to be a key focus at the moment for myself, but it gives you the mathematic equations that you need to calculate things like composite SLAs and how you actually calculate these things, rather than just saying you need to have a composite SLA. We actually tell you how to calculate that, how to factor that in with multi-regions, and all those different bits and pieces, and point you to the SLA documentation and how to find that information. So it's been, one of my customers has been blown away. Like I mentioned a composite SLA, and the actual understanding of a composite SLA was very different. So the fact that we had something in our documentation that clarified what we define that as part of the well-architected pillars, and then how they can go and calculate that for their workload, that was an absolute lifesaver for them. And then something they can take back to the business and go, look, we've taken this, we've gone through this assessment. And as you say, they only ticked the reliability box on the assessment because they didn't want to go through the rest. They were doing it for speed. And the value they got out of that, has meant that reliability has now become part of their baked-in process for new workloads. And even when their architects are designing new workloads, even if they're not going to take it to a board to say, we want to deploy this yet, they're almost like rating their own designs based on what their well-architected review score is, which is really nice to see.
Yeah, and that's exactly the position we want customers to get to, right? It's great that you can use the WAF documentation and so forth to be able to look at an existing workload and understand how you can improve it retrospectively. But of course, in an ideal world, we want customers to be moving to a state where they're using that best practice guidance prior to that workload being deployed, so that they're in the most secure, well-architected state.
Actually, for me, it's kind of raising awareness of getting the most out of the Azure platform as well, right? It's security functionality with Azure Defender, and even the concept of availability zones and ASR, and how we manage that availability may not be known until people start to read the well-architected framework. So I think it's a good kind of way to understand the platform more from an educational point of view, if anything.
Yeah, I totally agree, Ryan. Totally agree, absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered WAF really nicely, I think, in this session this afternoon, and it's been great to have you along, Chris. I suppose before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to add, or anything, where can people find you online? Are you on Twitter? Are you on LinkedIn? Where can people get in touch?
Yeah, you can definitely find me on LinkedIn. Maybe I'll ping the links in, and you can expose those after the session, Jack. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter as well. You can follow me at DoFreeUK. Please don't ask me why that's my my name. Long story, we won't go into it now. But yes, definitely, if you're interested in well architected, then certainly hit me up on Twitter.
Fantastic. Well, it's been great to have you along, Chris, and thanks again for joining us. And I suppose thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, Chris, and
thanks very much, Jack.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, Ryan. Cheers, Jack.